For more on the Independent going digital and the general idea of where the print media will go, we're joined by, in London, Mr. Terry Kirby, who is the director of the School of Journalism at Goldsmiths University of London. He's also a founding member of the staff, former night editor and chief reporter at The Independent. Welcome, sir. Meanwhile, in Miami from the United States, we're joined by Mr. Eric Newton, Innovation Chief and Professor of Practice at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism in Arizona State University. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. Well, I guess it's pretty much a mixed feeling for you, Mr. Kirby, working for The Independent and now seeing it's likely to go digital only. What does it mean to you?
Well, I find it's very sad in one sense. It's very poignant in another. It's sad because it is the end of an era of a particular newspaper that I was very closely associated with. It occupied a large portion of my life, my professional life. It's sad also because it will mean the loss of a number of jobs of journalists who've been working for the print edition. The exact figures are not clear, but it could be around 100. It's very poignant because the great tradition of print newspapers, which grew up in Victorian times in the 19th century around the world, is dying out. And newspapers were a unique way of reflecting the times we have lived in, and so that is also very poignant. But on the other hand, I do not think the news is entirely bad.
Well, we could be a little bit reminiscent at this point because this is also the year 30 years after The Independent made its appearance to the public. But at the same time, isn't that a general trend that print newspapers likely to be digital only now, particularly inside the United States? Professor Newton.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
Well, yes. In the United States, I think you could say generally that print is, it's like the sun. It's rising in the east and setting in the west. And in all the Western industrialized countries, we're seeing the print circulation falling and digital viewership and users growing. And so it's really just a matter of time before nearly all of the traditional print outlets are digital.
Well, it is one thing whether you would be able to hold a physical newspaper in your hand. It could be sentimental. But the most important thing is whether it's on paper or it appears on various screens. The most important thing is whether the subscribers will be big enough, that body, to support the operation of a real journalism organization. That is the most important question to be asked. Professor Newton, what about the situation inside the US? Is it possible, depending on subscribers online?
Well, no. I mean, there will be some digital publications that will be fine with just subscribers. There will be others that will be successful because they are part of our public broadcasting system. There are others that will be successful because they are partnerships with television, hybrid models. Some of the news from journalism schools will become more important. Some of the news will be from nonprofit news providers who use events and memberships and other vehicles for revenues. And of course, there still is advertising, and some of the publications will be able to make it with advertising.
Mr. Kirby, do you think The Independent will be able to survive in the future digital only, depending on subscribers' input and also advertisers?
Well, let me say first of all that I agree with the professor there that there are going to be a variety of models in the future. Different ways of doing journalism online, and I don't think there is a case of one size fits all. We are in an extended period of transition from the age of print to the age of digital. There are obviously ways in which some publications can survive online. Whether The Independent will be able to do that in the same way, I think, is really the big question. it is going to be entirely dependent upon how the newspaper that is presented in the online version. Will it be entirely focused on clickbait, or will it be as much as possible an online version of the current print editions? I think it will have to rely upon a large number of named writers that have given the paper the credibility and gravitas that has kept a loyal readership. And it needs to retain the same values of being questioning, of being largely politically independent,
right,
of not being beholden to any political party. And I think these are reasons why people love the Independent and why people will hopefully be brought onto the online version.
Professor Newton, while listening to Mr. Kirby, you could tell this is a gentleman, together with his colleagues, still very much willing to do quote-unquote real journalism. Inside your country, for example, real journalism, really respected traditional journalism, has not survived very well among many of the publications, shall we say. For example, with the Washington Post, yes, it's an exception because Mr. Bezel volunteered to support this specific newspaper for its credibility. New York Times, another exceptional example, because the family business wants to maintain its credibility. But many others did not survive at these two. So when you listen to what Mr. Kirby has pledged earlier, does it ring a bell to you? Or actually you can have a big smile on your face and pat on his shoulder and say, brother, way to go?
Yeah. It's not an easy answer. In the short run, there are many problems with the digital transition. In the United States, we have a news system that was built up town by town, city by city, with the daily newspaper becoming a very important part of every community's life. Those daily newspapers all across the United States have suffered many, many thousands of job losses. So we do have a local news crisis in the United States. Not really with the Washington Post or the New York Times or many of the national brands, but the local news, that's where it was only the newspaper who would watch over the government officials and the powerful in town and provide a voice to people who had no voice.
Mr. Kirby, is that likely to happen also in the UK? Will the similar situation happen?
Well, I think yes, I think this is exactly what's happening in the UK. There is a deficit. Local newspapers, in the same way as in America, have basically crumbled. They're just not present in communities in the same way. I began my career more than 35 years ago on a local newspaper, which was a fairly vibrant part of the local community. And it is really important about holding local power structures to account, about representing the views of ordinary people, about being part of communities. And that need is still there. But unfortunately, in many parts of the United Kingdom, it really isn't happening at all.
Well,
and equally, that applies at national level, that newspapers need to retain the same values of scrutiny of the authorities and the public figures and the politicians and business, which is what we are here to do. And if websites become focused entirely on celebrities and clickbait, which is the danger, then it is a very, very sad day for democracy.
Professor Newton, do you think that value system, what we call the credibility of a news organization, which is traditionally believed as the most important thing ever about our trade, is that still there? Will that still be there? Two things. One is financial challenges. Second is citizen journalism becoming ever more important.
Well, all these things are happening at the same time. At the same time that there's more sensational news, there is also, on a global scale, more investigative news available to the average person. 20 years ago, you could not look at the World Wide Web and see the best investigative journalism from around the world. That wasn't possible. It's now possible. But on a local level, it's difficult. I'm optimistic in the long run that people will seek out the news that helps them run their lives and their governments, and they will need it, and they will need even more meaning in the sea of information and data that we are swimming in. The long term is I'm optimistic. It's the short-term economics where companies that were built to deliver the news a certain way are finding that the news is atomizing. All the different pieces of the newspaper are going to some other place in the digital ecosystem. And so we're going to suffer, maybe for an entire generation, a very rough transition.
But here is an interesting scenario, as many of the insiders have been talking about. Will, in the future, Mr. Kirby, journalism becoming something of nonprofit? What I mean is, news media organization is not likely to make profits, but rather being supported by those who subscribe to the ideologies that the newspaper wants to promote, and also by the citizens who would like to have a so-called force power to scrutinize the current system. Is that scenario likely to happen?
No. I don't see how it can happen. I don't think you can have sort of crowd-funded journalism on a mass scale, if that's really what you're referring to. Well, I'd like to see the model. I'd like to see it done. Newspapers or news gathering organizations, whether it's in print or online, require a good deal of professional organization and maintenance. It may well be that such a model might emerge in the future. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out, but traditionally, to do the kind of authoritative, responsible journalism that we need, you need to pay for authoritative, responsible journalists to do their jobs, and that doesn't always come cheap.
Professor Newton, though, what are we going to see in the near future? Because let's face some facts. Yes, the citizens want the media to scrutinize the government, make sure it is going to run based on its promises. But at the same time, many of the readers of whether online or offline newspapers or media do not necessarily want to pay for what they read, what they watch. This is about the internet culture in a way. Are we going to have another huge crisis in which this kind of practice will be scrutinized before the whole society realize we have to figure out a new way for the short-term possibility?
I think that's exactly right. Things are going to get worse before they get better.
It's always right to say that, isn't it?
They'll get.
Yeah. I think it's true.
Or you might say that they're going to get worse and better at the same time, but we'll only pay attention to the worst part. But I do, there are new nonprofit models emerging in the United States. Some of them involve of nonprofits that are supported by donors and by members. Some of them involve education-based non-journalism, like the Cronkite News at Arizona State. Some of them are very small, sort of mom and pop, hyper-local news outlets. And these are all growing and gaining. It's likely they will never be exactly what came before. And so the question is not how do we save what came before, but how do we reinvent journalism for the coming century for young people who are used to getting news, not just digitally, but on their mobile devices, and for the future generations that will get it even more differently in ways we can barely imagine.
Of course, journalism is a traditional trade, but at the same time, Mr. Kirby, it is shouldering the responsibility of enlightening the public while at the same time serving the public. How much do you expect that can be done online together with your colleague? Very briefly, we only have 40 seconds left.
Well, I think it can be done online. There is no reason why the same values can't be translated online. The Guardian, for instance, has an extremely successful website which embodies all the virtues of the Guardian newspaper. Nobody's under any doubt of what that is. I think the model is more difficult to implement at a local level, although we are trying it with our student journalists.
Okay.
We serve a local community with journalism students, filling in a gap between the provision of local news in London.
Professor Newton, 10 seconds for you, unfortunately.
The future eventually will work because people need a fair, accurate, contextual search for the truth to make modern societies possible.
All right.
In the end, it'll be okay.
Eric Newton from the United States, Terry Kirby from the UK. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Keep our fingers crossed. Thanks.
Thank you.